The guns went quiet. For the first time in over 3 years, soldiers on both sides of the most brutal land war Europe has seen since 1945 were told to stop shooting. Not because either side had won, not because either side had surrendered, but because one man picked up the phone, called two enemies, and both of them said yes. What does it mean when the world's most unpredictable president pulls off the one thing that every diplomat, every negotiator, and every world body has failed to do for 3 years straight? And what does it mean when that ceasefire is tied to a Russian national holiday that Ukraine calls a symbol of imperial conquest? That is what we are about to break down completely. This is one of the most consequential foreign policy developments of the decade, and it happens so fast that most of the world is still catching up. Today on the Jang Report, we are going deep on this story. We are going to tell you exactly what Trump announced, word for word, and what those words actually mean beneath the surface. We are going to walk you through 3 years of war history so you understand exactly why this moment is so significant. We are going to expose the detail that mainstream media is glossing over, the one angle that changes how you read this entire ceasefire. And by the end of this video, you are going to be able to answer the question that matters most. Is this the beginning of peace, or is this the beginning of Russia winning? Before we go any further, if you find this channel covers stories like this before anyone else with the depth they actually deserve, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because when this story breaks again, and it will break again, you need to be the first to know. Let us get into it. It was May 8th, 2026. Trump posted to Truth Social. No press conference, no prepared remarks, no State Department briefing, just a post. And that post stopped the war. Trump announced a 3-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine to mark the 80th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, what Russia calls Victory Day. The ceasefire would include a complete suspension of all kinetic military activity, all drone strikes, all artillery, all ground advances. Everything stops. But that is not all. Paired with the ceasefire came a prisoner exchange. 1,000 prisoners from Russia, 1,000 prisoners from Ukraine, 2,000 human beings, soldiers, captured fighters, possibly civilians, crossing the lines to go home. In a war defined by its brutality toward prisoners of war, this is not a footnote. It is a headline on its own. Trump's statement made clear this was not brokered through the United Nations, not through NATO, not through the European Union. He said the request was made directly by him, and he very much appreciated its agreement by President Vladimir Putin and President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Both men said yes. That is the breaking moment. That is the fact that changes every assumption about where this war is headed. To understand why this is so extraordinary, you need to understand what it took to get here. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Putin called it a special military operation. The rest of the world called it what it was, a land invasion designed to erase Ukraine as an independent nation. The early days were catastrophic. Russian columns moved on Kyiv. The world feared Ukraine would fall within days. It did not fall. Ukraine fought back with stunning effectiveness. Western weapons flooded in. Russia's initial assault collapsed. But what followed was not a Ukrainian victory. It was a grinding war of attrition that has consumed hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. By mid-2024, Russia had regained momentum. Ukrainian counteroffensive stalled. Ammunition supplies from Western allies ran short. Conscription pressures in Ukraine mounted. By 2025, Russian forces had made incremental but consistent territorial gains in the east, in Donetsk, in Zaporizhia, along the Dnipro River basin. Multiple ceasefire attempts failed. The Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, negotiated after Russia seized Crimea and the Donbass, those were violated within months. Every subsequent diplomatic effort, talks in Istanbul in 2022, back-channel negotiations in 2023, collapsed before producing anything binding. Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, promising to end this war within 24 hours. That promise was not kept. But his administration did maintain pressure on both sides, with the U.S. threatening to reduce military aid to Ukraine and signaling warmer terms toward Moscow than the previous administration. Now, over a year into his second term, Trump has something real, something tangible. 3 days of silence across the most violent front line in the world. But here is the part that no one in the mainstream press is talking about, and it changes everything. Stay with us. We are just getting to the most important part of this story. And if this is the kind of depth you have been looking for, subscribe right now. Hit that bell. We are not slowing down. 3 men are at the center of this moment. Each of them had reasons to say yes, and each of them had reasons to say no. Donald Trump. He has spent his second term positioning himself as the only leader in the world capable of ending this war. He has frustrated European allies with his openness to Russian territorial claims. He has pressured Zelenskyy privately and publicly. Trump's political identity at this point is deeply tied to the narrative of peace through strength. This ceasefire is personal for him. It is a win he will run on, promote, and leverage as proof of his diplomatic dominance. Vladimir Putin. Russia's president agreed to this ceasefire, and the timing matters. May 9th is Victory Day in Russia, the single most important national holiday on the Russian calendar. 80 years after the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, Putin can now stand on the stage in Red Square, preside over the military parade, and announce that the war in Ukraine is paused. He frames himself as a statesman rather than a warmonger. He gains a propaganda victory. And crucially, military analysts will note, Russian forces used the last major ceasefire period in 2022 to regroup, resupply, and redeploy. 3 days of quiet has operational value. Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The Ukrainian president is in the most difficult position of the three. His country is fighting for its existence. Every pause in fighting carries risk. Ukraine's military has been under sustained pressure. But Zelenskyy also needs this. He needs the prisoner exchange. 1,000 of his soldiers coming home is a political and humanitarian gain he cannot refuse. And he knows that maintaining Trump's favor is essential to keeping any Western support flowing. 3 men, 3 calculations, 1 agreement. And the world is holding its breath. What does a ceasefire actually look like on a 600-mile front line? It is messy, it is fragile, and it almost always involves violations. On the ground in eastern Ukraine, the front lines have been brutally static in some areas and violently contested in others. Cities like Bakhmut, which fell to Russian forces, became symbols of the war's human cost. Drone warfare has transformed the battlefield. Both sides use first-person view drones to hunt individual soldiers, vehicles, and positions. Silence in this war is not natural. Soldiers on both sides will be suspicious. Commanders will watch for violations. Prisoner exchanges in this war have happened before, through negotiated deals often brokered with help from third parties, but nothing at this scale. 1,000 from each side in a single swap is historic. Some of these prisoners have been held for years. International observers and human rights organizations have documented torture, malnourishment, and psychological abuse in both Russian and Ukrainian detention facilities. The men and women coming home in this exchange are not just numbers. They are people, soldiers who endured things that most of us cannot imagine. For Ukrainian civilians in frontline zones, the families in Kherson, in Kharkiv, in the villages along the Zaporizhzhia line, 3 days without artillery is 3 days where a child might sleep without a ceiling shaking above them. 3 days where a grandmother does not have to sprint to a shelter. It is not peace, but it is a taste of it. And after 3 years, even a taste means something. Remember the question we opened with: is this the beginning of peace, or is this the beginning of Russia winning? Here is what we now know, and the answer is more complicated than either side wants to admit. The international reaction to this announcement is a study in carefully measured words, because no one in the diplomatic world is quite sure how to read it. European leaders are cautious. NATO allies have spent years funding Ukraine's defense, and any ceasefire that is not accompanied by clear security guarantees for Ukraine is viewed with suspicion in Brussels, Warsaw, Berlin, and London. European governments fear that a pause gives Russia time to consolidate its gains, rearm its depleted units, and resume the offensive from a stronger position. At the United Nations, the Secretary General's office welcomed any reduction in hostilities. That is the standard diplomatic language, while stopping well short of calling this a path to peace. In Kyiv, the reaction is visibly tense. Ukrainian officials are supporting the ceasefire publicly, but the posture on the ground tells a different story. Ukrainian military commanders have reportedly issued orders to maintain defensive readiness throughout the pause. They are not standing down. They are watching. In Moscow, the announcement lands on the eve of Victory Day celebrations, and state-controlled Russian media is presenting this as a Russian-led humanitarian gesture, as though Putin himself were the architect of the pause, rather than the recipient of a presidential phone call. In Washington, Republicans are celebrating. Democrats are divided, with some crediting Trump's deal-making instincts and others warning that 3 days of quiet does not a peace deal make. And on social media, across every platform and every language, the response is volcanic. The word ceasefire is trending in 16 languages simultaneously. Here is what almost nobody is saying out loud. This ceasefire is anchored to Russia's Victory Day, May 9, the day Russia celebrates the Soviet Union's defeat of Nazi Germany. It is the most politically loaded date on the Russian national calendar, and it is the date Putin chose, or accepted, as the symbolic frame for this pause. Think about that for a moment. Ukraine has spent 3 years resisting Russian propaganda that frames the invasion as a denazification mission, an attempt to invoke World War II imagery to justify a modern land grab. Every time Putin uses World War II symbolism, he is leveraging it against Ukraine. And now, the first major ceasefire of this war is being announced and will be celebrated on Russia's most potent World War II anniversary. Ukrainian officials have long argued that Russia's use of Victory Day symbolism is itself a form of information warfare. The parade in Moscow on May 9 will feature Russian troops, Russian military hardware, and Putin at the podium, all while a ceasefire he agreed to bears his name as a statesman. Trump's announcement does not frame this as a Russian holiday. It frames it as a pause to mark the Soviet Union's World War II victory, which technically includes Ukraine, since Ukrainians fought and died in enormous numbers during that war. But in the information environment we live in, framing is everything. And right now, the framing is working in Moscow's favor more than in Kyiv's. This is the hidden angle. It is not sinister enough to say the ceasefire is a trap, but it is significant enough to say that the symbolism of this pause may matter as much as the pause itself. Now let us talk about what happens when the guns come back on, because 3 days ends, the clock is ticking, and what comes after May 11th could determine the course of this war for years. 3 days is not peace. Let us be very clear about that. If this ceasefire holds, and that is not guaranteed, it will end on May 11th. What happens on May 12th could go in several directions, and the stakes of each direction are enormous. If Russia uses these 3 days to resupply its frontline units, rotating fresh troops in, moving ammunition forward under cover of the pause, then the ceasefire has functioned as a force multiplier for the side that was already advancing. Military analysts have warned consistently that any pause in this conflict benefits the side with the deeper reserve capacity. That side is Russia. If Ukraine uses the pause to rest depleted units, consolidate defensive positions, and publicly signal to Western allies that it accepted this ceasefire under diplomatic pressure rather than military weakness, then Zelenskyy has threaded a very narrow needle. He shows flexibility without appearing to concede. If this ceasefire becomes a template, if Trump uses the success of 3 days to push for a 30-day extension, then a permanent truce tied to a territorial settlement, then we are looking at a genuine end-of-war negotiation. That would require Ukraine to potentially accept the reality of Russian control over occupied territories. That is the price of peace that Zelenskyy has said he will never pay. Whether that position holds under sustained pressure is the central question of the next phase of this conflict. The economic stakes are also enormous. The war has disrupted global grain supplies, energy markets, and supply chains across Europe. A genuine peace deal could lower energy prices, stabilize European economies, and redirect billions in military aid toward reconstruction. The human stakes are the ones that matter most. Hundreds of thousands are already dead. Millions are displaced. Every day of war adds to that number. 3 days of silence saves lives. That is not nothing. That is everything. Analysts across the spectrum are cautiously parsing what this means. Military analysts with backgrounds in NATO doctrine have pointed out that tactical ceasefires in active conflicts almost universally benefit the side with greater strategic depth, in this case, Russia. The concern is not that the ceasefire is fake. The concern is that it is real, and that 3 days of real silence gives Russian logistics networks time to move. Political scientists who study conflict termination, the academic field devoted to understanding how wars end, have noted that temporary humanitarian pauses, when they hold, do establish behavioral precedent. If Putin does not violate this ceasefire, it becomes harder for him to justify violating the next one. Each successful pause slightly increases the cost of returning to full-scale war. Foreign policy analysts focused on the Trump administration have observed that this announcement is consistent with Trump's deal-making style. Announce a win, generate momentum, use the momentum to push for a bigger deal. The concern is that Trump's urgency to close a deal could lead him to pressure Ukraine into accepting terms that leave it strategically vulnerable. European security experts have noted that the NATO alliance's posture has not changed. Alliance commitments remain in place. But there is genuine nervousness in European capitals that a US-brokered peace deal, negotiated without full European consultation, could produce a settlement that leaves Ukraine exposed, with no NATO membership, limited territorial sovereignty, and a peace that looks more like a frozen conflict than a genuine resolution. And economists tracking reconstruction costs have estimated that rebuilding Ukraine, even in a best-case peace scenario, will require hundreds of billions of dollars over decades. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II cost roughly $13 billion in 1948. Adjusted for today, that would be over $170 billion. Ukraine's reconstruction needs are estimated by the World Bank to exceed $500 billion. Peace, if it comes, will not be cheap. We asked at the beginning, is this the beginning of peace, or is this the beginning of Russia winning? The honest answer is this: it could be both. And that is what makes this moment so genuinely historic and so genuinely dangerous at the same time. Here are the 3 scenarios that analysts believe are most likely to unfold from this point. Best case, the ceasefire holds cleanly. No major violations occur. The prisoner exchange is completed in full. Trump leverages the success to propose a 30-day extension. Both sides agree. A formal peace framework begins to take shape, possibly with Ukraine receiving security guarantees short of NATO membership, something like the model used for Finland or Austria during the Cold War. The war does not end this year, but a genuine off-ramp emerges. Europe begins reconstruction planning. Markets stabilize. Likely case. The ceasefire holds technically, but is violated in small ways. Drone surveillance, minor skirmishes in disputed areas, that neither side escalates publicly. The prisoner exchange happens, but may be incomplete. Trump claims a political win regardless. The ceasefire is not extended. Both sides return to combat on May 12th. But the episode creates a diplomatic opening that leads to resumed back-channel talks over the next several months. The war continues, but at a slightly reduced tempo, as negotiations run in parallel with the fighting. Worst case, one side, most likely Russia, commits a significant violation before the 3 days expire. Ukraine uses the violation to demand a halt to negotiations and a resumption of full Western military support. European allies, already skeptical, pull away from the Trump peace framework. The US and Europe fracture over Ukraine policy. The war intensifies. Trump distances himself from the ceasefire failure, and the window that opened this week closes, possibly for years. We want to hear from you on this one, because this is genuinely one of those moments where the right answer is not obvious, and your perspective matters. Here is the first question. Do you think this 3-day ceasefire is a genuine first step toward ending the Russia-Ukraine war? Or do you think it gives Russia a military advantage it will use the moment fighting resumes? And here is the second. Trump has now gotten both Putin and Zelenskyy to agree to something at the same time. No one in the Obama or Biden administration managed to pull that off. Does that change how you see his foreign policy approach, regardless of your political views? Drop your answers in the comments below. We read them all, and the best ones, the most thoughtful ones, we highlight in the next video. This is a community built on serious thinking. Bring it. Let us bring this home with the 3 things you need to take away from today's report. First, this ceasefire is real, confirmed, and historic. Whatever comes next, the fact that both Putin and Zelenskyy said yes to the same thing at the same time is an extraordinary diplomatic development. Do not let anyone minimize that. Second, the framing matters. A pause tied to Russia's Victory Day is a pause that fits better into Moscow's narrative than Kyiv's. Watch how each side tells the story of this ceasefire in the coming days. That narrative battle is as important as anything happening on the ground. Third, 3 days is not peace. Watch May 12th. Watch what happens the morning after this ceasefire expires. What Russia does on that day, whether it resumes immediately or holds back, will tell you everything you need to know about whether any of this is real. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could determine whether the Russia-Ukraine war ends in a negotiated settlement or whether this ceasefire becomes a footnote in a war that grinds on for another decade. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when this breaks, and it will break, we will be the first to cover it with the depth it deserves at the speed it demands. History does not wait, neither should you.